that in the very night when Babylon fell and was taken over by the Medo-Persians, the events recorded in chapter 5, that Daniel was called to interpret the writing on the wall. And given the distance between Shushan and Babylon, which is actually a distance of over 165 kilometers, Daniel could not have been in Susan to travel in time to come to interpret the vision, or the people who were given the command to bring him in to explain the vision. So to explain the writing. So we actually established by some very specific points, even comparing with a different version. Notice that in chapter 8, Daniel was actually taken in vision. And the reason he was taken in vision was because the events that he's being shown did not concern Babylon, but concerned concerned the Persian Empire. In other words, the very important point in Daniel chapter 8, which is verse 14, the 2300 years prophecy, the end of which the cleansing of the sanctuary was going to begin. So Daniel is being here told that the numbering, or the or rather the consideration of the time must be reckoned from the days of the Persian Empire. And we also observed here that it is exactly at this point we are introduced to changes in the Medo-Persian Empire, when one of the richest kings, whose account is recorded much among many of the Persian kings in detail in the book of Esther, who is King Xerxes or King Ahasuerus, who rallies all his forces against the Greeks, but then the Greeks coming under Alexander to conquer him. And the next king who comes after Xerxes of the Persians, who is King Artaxerxes I, gives the famous decree recorded in Ezra chapter 7 for the Jews to go, notice, as we'll study in chapter 9, which I'm not going to discuss today, or at any point in this study, you are going to observe that the command was not only for the Jews to go, but it had very specific connotations to restore and to rebuild Jerusalem. So to restore Jerusalem to the city status, as well as to commence the work of rebuilding. And the decree given to Ezra was very complete, which actually could be the point where we begin to reckon the commencement of the 2300 years prophecy. Now I want just to go back to a specific point before moving, but I want to also jump ahead of myself to simplify a little bit of the study. Notice here in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 19, it said, let me rather just focus on verse 20 on Daniel chapter 8. It says, the ram which you saw having two horns are the kings of Media and Persia. This is an explanation that is given. And the rough god is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So we have a clear explanation here of the meaning of the ram, which we are observing correctly, that here it is the Medians and the Persians, and the god representing the Grecians. But the great horn, or the horns, are signified as the kings, or the series of kings who would be at the head of these empires. Now notice, going back to the book of Daniel chapter 8 and verse 4, it says here, I saw the ram, that is the Medo-Persians, they were pushing westward and northward and southward. We identified yesterday that Persia expanded its conquest by attacking Lydia, Egypt, and Babylon. Lydia, Babylon, and Egypt. Lydia obviously to the west, Babylon to the north, and Egypt to the south. And Persia at its height would increase from 120 provinces recorded in Daniel chapter 6 verse 1 all the way to 127 provinces recorded in the book of Esther chapter 9 and verse 9, and also in Esther chapter 1 verses 1 and verse 2. So, territory or estate-wise, the empire expanded from the west all the way from the near, from the near east. From the far west all the way to the near east. That is from the Mediterranean to the Caspian Sea. It was such a huge empire, and it was composed of a lot of riches. We identified that fact yesterday. Now notice, and the Bible says that so that no beast might stand before him, and neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. It's quite impressive that when God describes the Medo-Persians to Isaiah, speaking about that, the Medo-Persians were the ones who were going to come and to conquer the Babylonians. He uses some very interesting words. I'm going to read here in the book of Isaiah chapter 13. It says here, and the prophet here is speaking about the fall of Babylon. Is speaking about the fall of Babylon. And in chapter 13 and verse 1, it even says, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did say. So everything that he then reads, or that he then writes, or that is recorded from verses 2 all the way to the last verse, they concern Babylon. But my focus is on verse 17 that says, behold, I will stir the Medes against them, which shall not regard silver, and as for gold, they shall not delight in it. And it says, their bows also shall dash the young men to pieces, and they shall have no pity on the fruit of the womb. Their eye shall not spare the children. And Babylon, the glory of the kingdoms, the beauty of the Chaldees' excellency, shall be as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. So you'd observe here that when the Bible describes the Medo-Persians, it says that they are cruel. Yeah, it says that the Medo-Persians, they are cruel, and they did not discriminate in the exercise of their cruelty. And here we also observed the use in Daniel chapter 8 verse 4 of the fact that there was neither any that could deliver out of his hand. In other words, whatever kingdom was subject to the Medo-Persians experienced the worst of the kingdom of the Medians, because they had practices that we continually see, for example, in the book of Daniel and in the book of Esther. In Daniel, we are introduced to their laws in Daniel chapter 6, verses 8, 12, and verse 15, as well as in Esther chapter 1 and verse 19, when it speaks about the laws of the Medians and Persians, which could not be revoked or altered, even though they could be they were founded on notions of injustice. Like the Bible is very replete with various pieces of information concerning the cruelty of the Medians and the Persians. And here it says, and also says, neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand, but he did according to his will. Obviously, it's impressive here that Nebuchadnezzar, when he confesses about the greatness of God in Daniel chapter 4 and verse 35, he speaks about how God doeth as he pleases. Here you see the Medo-Persians, they are said to be doing according to their will. He says, but he did according to his will, or whatever he pleased. You would actually observe this in the history of the Medo-Persians that is presented in the Bible. And it says, and became great. The greatness here, obviously, Medo-Persia was great in terms of, the estate or the territory that it covered. But that is not the greatness that is being expressed here. The greatness here is used to demarcate self-exaltation. Yeah, the greatness is used to demarcate self-exaltation. For the root word that is used, it means to twist, or it's used to become, to be large in mind, in pride, to boast. Yeah, those are some of the words that are used to signify being great. And we actually observe the time when the Medo-Persian Empire exalted itself against the God of heaven. It is the account that are recorded in the book of Esther. When they attempt to wipe out an entire race of people for the simple reason that these people, their laws were not in harmony with the laws of the Medians and Persians, without even considering the estate of these people. Like we notice here in the book of Esther chapter 3 and verse 8, it says, "And Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom." Notice here, in all the 127 provinces, and it says, "Their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them." We would also observe that in the first year of Darius, when Daniel was subjected to the lion's den, Darius then acknowledged the power of God, and he wrote in the language of Media and Persia to all the people in all the provinces. So they had the knowledge of God. They were acquainted with the fact that even though the laws of this God differ from the laws of Media and Persia, they did not in any way subvert the authority of the Medians. For Daniel was a very excellent example in piety and goodness. And the king sought to change, to make laws, and here we see that the king, without any thought, in the words of Haman here, who says to the king, "They are dispersed among the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom. Their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them." Then he says, "If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business, to bring it into the king's treasuries." And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it unto Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So you notice that the king did not even have any second consideration. But throughout the chapter, or throughout the book of Esther, the king Xerxes or Ahasuerus is also presented before us as a self-indulgent king who actually embodies the worst excesses that are presented of the kingdom of Media here. So you notice that the greatness was magnified in going against the laws of God as they were being kept by the Jews. The idea of wanting to kill an entire people because they did not keep the laws of the state, but they kept laws that were separate, which we know to be the laws of God. Interestingly enough, you would also observe in the book of Esther that the Jews were living under conditions of religious intolerance. For even though you can tell that Mordecai, for example, and Esther, they feared God, you couldn't exactly pinpoint it because there is not even the mention of the word name of God, neither the mention of any worship directly, except the time that they prayed wherever they could and fasted. So you notice that they were also living under conditions of religious oppression and religious intolerance. So this is the exaltation that Daniel is speaking of here when he says in Daniel chapter 8 and verse 4 that that he did according to his will and became great. The greatness means exaltation against the God of heaven. And in most cases, when you study Bible prophecy, whenever a kingdom exalts itself, its time will David come. We notice that under Babylon, Daniel says to Belshazzar, "You have exalted yourself against the God of heaven and have desecrated the vessels of his temple." And here we see that the Medo-Persians, at the height of their power, they went against the laws of heaven. And what happens in the next verse, in verse 5, as I was considering, behold, and he, God, came from the west on the whole face of the earth. and touched not the ground, and the God had a notable horn between his eyes. When we read in verse 21, we're told the rough God is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. So we know clearly that the kingdom that followed after the Medo-Persians is Greece, and at the head of the Greeks was the first king, the notable horn, and history confirms that this first king was Alexander the Great. Notice that when we studied in Daniel chapter 7, we observed that the third beast, he had 4 wings, and it was like a leopard, to characterize the speed and agility. And here it is what is being mentioned when you see the description of the God. It says the God came from the west on the face of the whole earth. Obviously, Alexander, he sort of rose from among the Greek city-states all the way in Europe and covered the whole face of all the territory in the west. And you would remember that in Daniel chapter 2, the Daniel's interpretation, he had said to King Nebuchadnezzar, and a third kingdom of brass which shall bear rule over the whole earth. So here Alexander, he conquered the whole Western world, and then he comes with all the military might of the Western world, and this is what is being described here, that he came from the west on the whole face of the earth. Obviously, if he comes from the west, he is moving towards the east. Remember, Shushan, the capital of Persia, in the province of Elam, is in the Middle East. The place in Iran today, the place could be located in Iran today, in the region called Khuzestan. So here you see that he comes from the west. Alexander comes conquering all the way from Europe and moving towards the Middle East and towards the Far East, and he moved all the way towards India at the greatness of his power, and says he came from the west on the face of the whole earth and touched not the ground. The fact that he touched not the ground actually depicts the swiftness of the movement, of the God here. And it says, and the God had a notable horn between his eyes. It's impressive that it's almost as the description of the myth of the unicorn, which is believed to be a godlike animal that is very strong, but that had just one horn between his eyes, and this is what is described here, that at the head was this horn, this notable horn, and who is Alexander the king, obviously, who was leading the army of the Greeks. Verse 6 says, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing on the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. So you actually observe here that he comes with all the army from the west to go towards the east, and his target is the ram, which had been seen as conquering everything in the east, and where there was none that could deliver out of his hand, and it was the object of the Grecian Empire here. And it says, and he ran unto him in the fury of his power. Why does Alexander do that? Because we had observed yesterday in our study, especially when we looked at Daniel chapter 11 and verse 2, that it says that the 4th king among the Persians shall be far richer than all the other kings, and through his riches and his power he shall stir up awe against the realm of Grecia. So Xerxes, obviously, in his indulgence and thirst for power, you would see that he had moved his empire or his army to fight against the Grecians. And when Alexander comes, it is on this point of retaliation that he comes in the fury of his power against the Greeks for the insolence, against the Persians for the insolence that had been done by Xerxes in seeking to conquer the Grecians here. Obviously, in that battle, when he attempted to do that, he did not win. That is the reason for the party where he wanted to demonstrate his power in trying to raise a second army to go and fight against the Greeks. And I'm talking about the party in the book of Esther chapter 1. Now notice in verse 7 it says, I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler or rage against him, and smote the ram and brake his two horns. So obviously Alexander came and he put an end to the kingship, to the kingdom of the Medians and Persians. And it's interesting that the Bible uses the word and he came close unto him. Notice it's almost as saying that the goat which touched not the ground came close and touched, the ram which no one could deliver from. Came and says he was moved with rage or choler against him, and smote the ram and brake his two horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. But he cast him to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Because even in history it's very clear that the Medo-Persians, the Greeks, they completely conquered and took over from the Medo-Persians. Verse 8 then says, therefore the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. Says so. The he-goat here is described as it says it waxed very great. Obviously, we notice also that the greatness here does not have to do with territory, because we notice that Alexander by this time had already conquered the whole face of Europe, and he went and is taking over. So it doesn't have to do with estate, but it has to do with self-exaltation here. And you'd observe that Alexander began to think of himself as a god who deserved to be worshipped, going around and changing all manner of religions and also portraying his name among different cities. He exalted himself. It says, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. Obviously, the kingdom was divided into 4. In Daniel chapter 11 and verse 3, this is more clearly explained. I'm just going to read the text here. Daniel 11 and verse 3, when it says, and a mighty king shall stand up that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. So notice, the dominion is discussed, but also the Bible then turns to the person who was at the head of the kingdom. He shall rule with great dominion, as we observe that he conquered all the west and moved and also conquered all the territory of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then it says he shall do according to his will. And it says, but when he shall stand up, to stand up here to be made king, but we'll discuss that when we reach to Daniel chapter 11. It says, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided towards the 4 winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion with which he ruled, for his kingdom shall be plucked up even for others besides those. So here in verse 8, that's what is being discussed. That the he-goat waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and for it came up 4 notable ones towards the 4 winds of heaven. Notice also in verse 21 of Daniel chapter 8, and the rough goat is the king of Grecia, and the great horn that is between his eyes is the first king. Now that being broken, and whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. Obviously, this describes the division of the empire. Remember, in Daniel chapter 7, the third beast had 4 heads, denoting the division of the empire after the fall of Alexander into 4 separate kingdoms. Obviously, if it says towards the 4 winds of heaven, we notice that it is towards the east, towards the west, towards the north, and towards the south. So now here the kingdom divided into those 4 general zones after the death of Alexander the Great. What do we observe so far in this history is that truly prophecy is has decreed how the nations are going to move to the end of time. And we observe that it is their relationship with the laws of the God of heaven that either prolongs or that enables the nations, um, that prolongs or that sort of determines the time span of the career of the nations. In almost all the kingdoms we are observing here, we actually see that there is a rule that God allows a kingdom, and the kingdom is given the light of truth of the word of God, and the manner in which that kingdom deals with that light is the manner in which God weighs the options or weighs in the future of that kingdom. The Medo-Persians, we saw that the Babylonians, they were given light through the prophets Daniel. Here we also saw that the Medo-Persians, through Daniel, through people like Ezra, through people like Esther and Mordecai, they were given the opportunity to be acquainted with the truth of the God of heaven. They did not choose it. When we also come here to the Greeks, we still see the continued path of self-exaltation, even in light of the fact that they were given the truth concerning the laws of the God of heaven. And inasmuch as this applies to nations, we also observe that it is the actions of individuals, their choices and their decisions in respect to light, such as we would observe when we discuss Haman, when we discuss King Xerxes, who would seek for the exaltation of his power at the expense, not even considering anyone else except himself. And this is the message that comes to us, that even though God weighs up, the career of nations in light of how they respond to his truth, we literally observe that this reckoning also happens at the individual level. So for instance, how do we order our lives after receiving the word of truth? And how does that change or influence the pattern of our lives? This is the truth in which we need to consider these prophecies, to say that if this is the pattern in which God has dealt with nations in the past, with individual kings and with princes and with people within these various nations, does he in any case changes the way he deals with us today? And I think we need to examine our lives to see, are we also moving in the path of self-exaltation against the God of heaven by disregarding his requirements, or are we day by day submitting ourselves, seeking to know his will and cooperating with the work of God in the earth? We notice that all these kingdoms failed in doing so, and their time, it ended. And if you observe the fact that none of these kingdoms ended peacefully, they ended violently. And thus is the warning that comes to us concerning ordering lives in opposition to the will of God. May God bless the reading of his word as we continue in our studies of Daniel chapter 8. Amen.